Okay, good vach, Shemon Tov. We are up to Chaf Vav, Daf Chaf Vav Amud Aleph. We are learning Leila Nishmas Mendel, Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain, Neshama Shel Aliyah. We are at the 2 dots, the first set of 2 dots. Umidalos Aretz. So last one we were talking about was balsam oil. We had this terrible story about this mother-in-law who essentially killed her daughter through balsam oil because it's very flammable. And so now we go on a bit of a tangent about balsam oil. Apparently it was big expertise to cultivate balsam, and so the Torah tells us that when Nebuzaradan came along, the approach of the Babylonian kings, actually probably inspired by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were infamous for this. The Assyrians would come into a country, and the way they would keep control of the country is by taking everyone in that country and moving them somewhere else. Okay, and then taking people from the next country they go to and bring them to that country. And basically, the reason behind this is it allowed them to have real control. Because if you were just ruled over a group of people who were in their own country, they'd eventually push back. But this way, the Syrians would exile people and bring them to different places, and eventually they would just they would not be so powerful. This is what the 10 Shvatim are, at least according to many, completely lost because of the fact that they were presumably assimilated into the country that they went into, and that was exactly what the Syrians would do. So the Babylonians followed that, and that's why when the Babylonians conquered Eretz Yisrael, then what they did is they exiled all the people in Yehuda, all the people living in what was then Eretz Yisrael, to Bavel and elsewhere, but they left a couple of people behind. These people they left behind were people who had special skill sets that they couldn't just bring some other laborers in and teach them those skills. They were very unique skills. And one of those skills was collecting and cultivating balsam. And that's what we're going to see in this pasuk. Midalus Aretz, from the impoverished of the lands, Hishir, Nebuzaradan, Rav Tabachim. Nebuzaradan was the general. He's called the chief butcher, killing people. He left the Karmim Uliyogvim. What are Karmim Uliyogvim? Karmim, what is Karmim? Tani of Yosef Ilim Milakti Aparsamon, Me'engedi Ad Ramsa. These are the people who collected balsam, Aparsamon, from Ein Gedi until Ramsa. Okay, so he left those people there because it was a special skill, and they knew they weren't going to find a replacement. Yogvim, and who are the Yogvim? Elitziyari Chalazon Misulama Shal Tzur V'ad Haifa. The people, the Yogvim were people who hunted Chilazon. Chilazon is the animal, the snail or whatever exactly it is, fish, whatever exactly it is, and that brings about tchelas. So they left those people as well behind because that also is unique skill sets. Okay, now we come back to a discussion about what you're allowed to light with, what you're not allowed to light with. We're going to talk about something called tevel. Tevel, we've been talking about trumos, we've been talking about maestros. Tevel is food that is untithed. In other words, a person did not take any truma from it, did not take any meiser from it. It's called tevel. And we're going to learn over here some laws about lighting with tevel oil. Tanar Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, tevel tamei bechol. You're not allowed to use tevel oil to light even a tevel that is tamei during the week, and certainly not on Shabbos. Okay, we'll come back and explain why in a moment. Similarly, we're not allowed to use white naphtha during the week, and certainly not on Shabbos. So bishlam and leif lavan, we can understand why you can't use this white naphtha off because it's combustible, it's flammable. You're going to use this thing and it's going to cause a fire. Chazal didn't want to make sure you're not using fuel that's going to cause a fire. Aval tevel tamei my taima. So why can't you use tevel, which is tamei? Amar Kra, we learned from a pasuk that we quoted just a short little while ago. This pasuk is in reference to truma. And what does the pasuk say? Hashem says to the Kohanim, I gave you the safeguarding of my trumos, plural. Why does it say it in plural? To teach you b'shtei trumas kos medaber. The Torah is talking about 2 trumos that belong to the Kohen. What do you mean 2 trumos? There's one thing called truma. So what is it? Echas truma tehora, v'echas truma tamea. Teach you there's something called truma tehora, which of course is the typical truma that the Kohen receives, and there's also truma tamea that the Kohen also could benefit from. Where's the benefit? The benefit by truma tamea, as we saw, was that when it's being burnt, which you have to burn it, when it's being burnt, the Kohen's still allowed to benefit from the fire, in other words, to heat himself, to warm himself, to warm his home, to cook something with. Okay, but the Gemara now is going to infer something from there. Ma truma tahora in lechaba elamishas harama ve'elech, just like by truma tahora, the Kohen could only get it from the time that you took the truma, meaning you separate the truma. After truma tameya, also when something is tamei in lechaba elamishas harama ve'elech, it's only when it already becomes truma that you're able to benefit from it. But before it's truma, when it's just tevel and it's tamei tevel, you can't benefit from it. So from here we learn that tevel, which is tamei, untithed items which are tamei, you cannot benefit from it at all. Okay, now the Gemara is going to give a number of other items which you could and cannot use to light your Shabbos candles. Gufer, Shimon Elazar, Omer, Imalik, Mitzari. You can't use. V'chein haya Rabbi Shimon Elazar. Tzari is balsam. V'chein haya Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer tzari in alav tzraf be'atzek taf. Rabbi Shimon Elazar in another place said that tzari is it's really only sap. And what he means by that is to say that it's sap. It's not really something which is really substantive, and therefore it doesn't light very well, and that's why you can't use it, because it's just sap. Okay, another opinion over here. Anything that comes from trees, any substance which comes from trees, you cannot use for oil. It does not take well. Rishmael ben Broka says you're only allowed to use things which come from fruits. Tarfon says you're only allowed to use olive oil. When Rabbi Yochanan ben heard Rabbi Tarfon said he could only use olive oil, he got up and stood up and said, meaning he made a strong comment. Amar, what do the people of Bavel do? They only have sesame oil. And the people in Madai, they only have nut oil. In other words, they don't have access to olive oil. The people in Egypt, in Alexandria, Egypt, they only have radish oil. And the people in Kaputskiya only have naphtha. In other words, these people, what are they going to do? They're not going to light Shabbos candles? Can't be. Only what the Chachamim said you cannot use, that's what you cannot use, but all these other oils, all the ones we just listed, the Chachamim said you're allowed to use all these things, so don't bring up any restrictions. The bottom line is you can use any oil as long as it's not part of the list that was disqualified by the Chachamim, but your typical oil can be used, and that is the halacha. Most oils can be used. Umalikin, then he adds, Rav Yochanan ben adds, Malikin Hashem and Dagin, you're allowed to use fish oil. It's not so clear what fish oil is. Some say they squished the innards and it brought out some oil. Some say you actually took the fish eye. Whatever it is, basically a oil that comes from fish, with itran and with itran. You're allowed to use pakua oil. We used to talk about it coming from a certain tree, uveneft, and with nafta. Sumcha is now speaking specifically about flesh, meaning live items. He says you don't use anything that comes from any innards, ella b'shem and dagim, unless it's fish oil. Now, the Gemara asks, Sumchas and Tanakama. That's essentially what over here Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is called the Tanakama. That's essentially what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, that you're allowed to, when it comes to animals, the only animal you can use is fish. And Sumchas is basically saying the same thing. So what's the difference? The difference between them is Rav Bruna Amarav. Rav Bruna Amarav, if you recall, was of the opinion that even though there are invalid oils, and if you add a little bit of good oil to that, then that is enough to cause the bad oils to now be usable. So whenever you have people saying that a certain thing is invalid, and two people saying the same thing about this thing is invalid, what are they arguing about? We could assume, and we saw this earlier, the Gemara had the same answer before. What the Gemara assumes is that what they're arguing about is this halacha. In other words, one says these items, meaning substances from other animals, are invalid. The other one says, yeah, they're invalid, but if you add a little bit of kosher oil, a little bit of valid oil, then it's going to be allowed. And that's what they're arguing about. Even though they both say anything other than fish that can be used, one of them holds that if you add some other good oil to oil that comes from a regular animal, then it'll be allowed to be used. The other one does not agree. Okay, now we get into some halachos about tumah. It's going to take us for a little bit of time. Let's see. It's a little bit hard, but we'll make it. Tanya Rav Shimon Omer. Ben Elazar Omer. Shimon Elazar says, Kol yotzim min ha'etz ein bo mishum shalosh al shalosh. Anything that comes from a tree, any garment, well, less than a garment, any cloth that is made from a tree, it does not have the halacha of being tameh when it is 3 fingers by 3 fingers, 3 fingers by 3 fingers, like basically this much, that is the size. There are going to be certain things, as we're about to say, chutz mi pishtan. I skipped a word, but chutz mi pishtan. Flax, when it's that size, it could become tameh. Other items which come from a tree, flax comes from a tree, other items which come from a tree that create a cloth that's this size, meaning the place where my fingers are overlapping, they do not become tameh. Okay? The Gemara also said, Misachim bo, Rav Shimon Elazar said, the Brisa said, that you're allowed to use it for schach, right? The law by schach is anything which is not mekabel tumah, anything which is not susceptible to impurity, you're able to use for schach. So again, the halacha over here is being taught that anything that comes from a tree is not susceptible to tumah when it's that size. Okay, Amar Rabbi says like this. Rav Shimon Elazar of Tana Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, Rav Shimon Elazar, who we just quoted, and Tana Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, is teaching from the base of Rabbi Shmuel, Amru Davar Echad. They said the same thing. The Gemara sometimes does this, and what the Gemara is basically doing is, we just saw a statement from one person, and we're saying, oh, that's exactly the same thing as this other person. So what is this other teaching? Tana Dvei Rabbi Shmuel is taught in the base of Rabbi Shmuel. Okay, Amr Davar Echad. What is that? Rav Shimon Elazar had Amran. Rav Shimon Elazar, the memra, the statement we just said. Tana Rabbi Shmuel, Mahi. What's the teaching from the base of Rabbi Shmuel that we're saying is the same thing? Answers the Gemara. Tani Rabbi Shmuel hal v'nemru begadim b'Torah stam. Since throughout the Torah talks about clothing, begadim, and I'm going to add and it's talking about clothing which becomes tameh. Okay, that clothing could become tameh. Upar lacha kasu be'achamehem tzemer pishtin. And in one place it says begadim of wool and flax And there it talks about clothing of wool and flax. By the way, where is that? This week's Parsha. Parsha's Tazria, it talks about tzaras on clothing, begadim, and there it says, Samaru Pishtan. In Pishtan, it talks about the fact that it is specifically wool and flax begadim. So Mala Halan Samaru Pishtan, just like by tzaras, it's Samaru Pishtan, it's wool and flax. Afkol Samaru Pishtan. So too, everywhere that it says beged, it's referring to wool and flax. Okay, so what does that have to do with what we're talking about? So we're saying like this. Since the Torah talks about begadim becoming tamei in many places, and it says that the beged, which is tamei, we're going to learn soon, it could even be 3 fingers by 3 fingers, and what do we see? And that beged is talking about wool and flax. Now, wool is not something from a tree. Flax is something from a tree. So you see, in Tanav Devei Rabbi Shmuel, the only tree substance which is able to become tamei with 3 fingers by 3 fingers is flax. So basically what we're saying is Rav Shimon Elazar, who just said that only flax is the only tree substance which would become tamei with 3 fingers by 3 fingers, is saying the same thing as Tanav Rabbi Shmuel, who also says that only flax, as opposed to all other products that come from a tree, can become tamei with 3 fingers by 3 fingers. Rava disagrees that shlosha al shlosha b'shar begadim ika benayu. He says actually there is a small difference between Rav Shimon ben Elazar and Tanav Rabbi Shmuel, and that is regarding 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. A tefach is a fist. Okay, so whereas we're talking about, so far we're talking about 3 fingers by 3 fingers, here we're saying 3 tfachim. Okay, if you have 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim, and the third tefach, right, 1, 2, and then a 3, right? Rav Shimon Elazar islay l'tanav Rabbi Shmuel. Rav Shimon Elazar islay. Rav Shimon Elazar holds that when Shimon Elazar holds that when there is 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim, then by other pieces of clothing it would be tamei. L'tanav Rabbi Shmuel leislay. When it comes to whereas according to Rabbi Shmuel, since he says that we learn from the pasuk that anytime it talks about tuma by these begadim, it's going to only include semer and semer pishtim and not other begadim. He's going to say even if it's 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim, the next size up, it's still going to be tahora. Whereas Rav Shimon Elazar said that he said a more general rule: whenever we have a beged, it's going to be. Sorry, it's the other way around. Excuse me. Rav Shimon Elazar said specifically 3 fingers by 3 fingers, and therefore, if it's bigger than that, if it's 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim, there, if it's coming from a tree, it will be able to become tamei. Whereas Tanav Rabbi Shmuel says beged across the board, whether it's 3 tfachim or whether it's 3 fingers or 3 tfachim. In both cases, clothing that is not made from clothing that comes from a tree, aside from pishtan being the exception, will not become tamei if it comes from another substance. We're going to unpack this and spend a little bit more time with this tomorrow. I will see you then. Have a wonderful day.